Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on HVI podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Sean Anthony. Sean Anthony is the professor of the Ohio State University at the Department of Near Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures. And today's discussion is based on his book titled Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, The Making of the Prophet of Islam. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment just beneath that. And that being said, Sean, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. And I want to start us off with, what is the earliest evidence that we have for the Prophet Muhammad?
The earliest evidence that we have, well, it would probably be a fly sheet for a Syriac gospel manuscript. Not all the four gospels, just Matthew and Mark, I think, if memory serves. And that fly sheet, if you don't know what a fly sheet is, if you ever buy a book and you open up the cover, and you'll probably find a blank sheet of paper. That's part of the binding, right? And then you open up and then you have the title and things like that. So a fly sheet is that blank piece of paper that's part of the binding. Someone, after that manuscript was compiled and copied and things like this, wrote down more or less an eyewitness account of the Arab invasions of Roman Palestine and Syria. And on it, they also mentioned details of this very decisive battle at a place called Yarmouk. It's called Gabitha in this text. This was the major defeat of the Romans by the Arabs. And in that text, we have more or less a mention of Muhammad's name directly. Probably in two instances. The first instance is very difficult to see, but the second instance is very clear. It doesn't say much, but we do have a name. And so that's probably the earliest artifact that survives that mentions his name that we have that's reasonably datable within, say, like 2 years of his death.
And where does most of our information of Muhammad, where does most of our information about him come from? And since the Quran only has a handful of mentions, less than that.
So the Quran mentions Muhammad by name very few times. It's not ostensibly written by him or from his perspective, but he is arguably the main, or at least one of the main subject of it. He's what I would call the privileged addressee of the message. So when you think about the Quran, you got to think, what is its genre? How does it work? Ostensibly, it's God speaking through the angel of Gabriel directly to a person and then providing him instructions. So it's that kind of disembodied divine voice. For the most part, it's talking directly to that individual, narrating aspects of his experience, framing aspects of his experiences, telling him what to say, what to preach, what to legislate, and things like that. So it's a very indirect way of getting at like who Muhammad is and what he's about. But ostensibly, the text doesn't say, I, Muhammad, wrote this, or I, Muhammad, this is what I transcribed from golden tablets handed to me by the angel Gabriel, or something like this. It is this direct kind of divine speech compiled in this text. Muhammad's name does appear in that text, but very rarely. It doesn't say, "Oh, Muhammad," or something like that. A lot of times it refers to Muhammad as the Nabi, as the prophet, as the Rasul, as the messenger, but it does not. It only rarely refers to Muhammad by name. Otherwise, we're mostly dependent upon, at least in the Arabic sources, texts that probably originate in the first half of the 700s, so the first half of the 8th century. But our earliest specimens that survive in terms of material evidence, they really don't start showing up until the late 700s and the early 800s, and our more systematically compiled materials mostly date around that same time period. So that hinge from the late 8th to the early 9th century. Otherwise, we do have some pretty early discussions of a figure named Muhammad, what the motivations behind the conquest are, and they seem to be relatively broadly accurate. Probably the most famous of these is a text written in the early 660s. We don't really know who did it. It's not attributed to anyone in the manuscript, but it's influential in a lot of other accounts. It's written particularly in Armenian. It's written itself in Armenian, and the author says that he's relying upon accounts given to him by refugees from Palestine that reached him about the Arab conquest. He's usually known as Sabios. We call him Pseudo-Sabios. The reason that the name Sabios is attributed to that text is not because it claims to be by a bishop of Armenia named Sabios, but rather modern historians that first kind of encountered the text and their significance, they speculated that it might be this bishop named Sabios. It's actually not really any basis for that. Matter of fact, there's some reasons to not think that. But in any case, he gives a pretty detailed description of who Muhammad is. He knows he's a traitor. He knows he receives divine law from on high. He knows some aspects of that divine law, including don't eat pork and don't drink wine and don't fornicate and don't lie and things like that. And he also provides a story about the impetus behind the conquest. So he kind of gives the answer of like, why are all these guys here? And he connects it to the idea of the Arabs considering themselves to be descended from Abraham to Ismail, and that entitling them to some claim on Abraham's patrimony. So the lands and the properties and stuff that belongs to Abraham. And so they're kind of being bequeathed to them. And they're going to take them from the Byzantines. And that includes basically the Holy Land. And we even have supposedly a response of the Roman emperor, or I can't remember if it's the Roman emperor or one of his generals, to a letter from the Ishmaelites where they announce this to the Romans, and they say to them instead, rather, your patrimony, your inheritance is the desert. And this plays into the idea that we find in Genesis of Abraham's son Ishmael and being the wild ass of the desert, right? So his inheritance is the desert, whereas the son of the promise, Isaac, his inheritance is the Holy Land. So it's a very interesting text for that reason. It's probably the richest text that we have that gives us sort of a who, what, where, why answer to the Arab conquest, who Muhammad was, and things like that. It has its problems, but it's early and it's pretty compelling.
Do most of our information that comes outside of the Quran about Muhammad come from the Hadith, or mostly other literature besides the Hadith, or would you say the Hadith and the rest of it combined?
Yeah, so that the Quran is very, it's not a small text by any means. It's substantial, but it's, you can easily fit it on your bookshelf. The Hadith is a very large kind of corpus that I guess, really as if you've ever seen it on a bookshelf, the Hadith are to the Quran like the Talmud is to the Torah in terms of size. It's a very large, sizable amount of material. And it's a bunch of materials that are graded by Muslims very differently. But if were you to put the Hadith on like a bookshelf, it would fill several shelves up. It's quite large. And so if one were to take even, all of the Hadith that are sort of vouched for by the Sunni tradition, then we would have a sizable amount of information about Muhammad, his diet, his dress, how he comported himself, what he looked like, what he liked to drink in the evening when he was relaxing. It's sort of like the most minute details of his life, not necessarily everything that we would want to know, but that has like a very high resolution, granular data about who Muhammad ostensibly was. So yeah, the Hadith is a very large corpus, very difficult to navigate and to master from the outside, but for the most part, that's been done for us. The Hadith serve as sort of like the raw material for narratives about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And they also serve as oftentimes raw material for exegesis or books that are interpreting the Quran. But really, I think their most important role is as sunan. Sunan, it means like laws or customs. So the Hadith are one of the main sources for establishing what Islamic law is and what Islamic law entails. The traditional number of verses that have legal importance in the Quran is usually set at 500. There's many more hadiths that count as so-called sunan, that is, hadiths or traditions that count as having some sort of legal import. It exceeds 1,000. Different numbers are given at different times, but it's a much larger kind of corpus, and much more difficult, I think, as an outsider to deal with. But later, in terms of his compilation.
What is the Sirah Maghazi literature? What do they say about Muhammad?
No. So the Sirah Maghazi literature is, first of all, define it. So Sirah usually has this, means like to march or to walk, sort of a way of behavior, a way of life is kind of the basic idea. Sometimes it's translated as biography. It doesn't quite mean that. Maghazi means raids or expeditions. It's sort of like, what's a good example? It's the same kind of title that you get with Arrian's History of Alexander. I think it's called Anabasis. I think that's what it's called. Same idea. Go on expeditions and going on like doing war and doing raids and fighting defensive battles and all this stuff. And so that literature compiles all together the different stories or different aspects of Muhammad's life. Usually has three main divisions. His life up to his birth until he's around 40 years old. And then his time in Mecca, usually around 12 years or so. And then his time in Medina between 622 until his death in 632. And the whole corpus can be called the Maghazi. His entire life can be called the Maghazi. But sometimes the Maghazi in particular refer to only the Medinan period of his life, so the last 10 years of his life, 11 years if you're counting in the lunar calendar. But for us, the last 10 years of his life. And I says our earliest examples of it that survive, a little bit disputed what they are, but our earliest examples are written by scholars from Medina. So they're scholars from that city or that polity that Muhammad founded in the year 622, ostensibly. The most famous of these is written by a guy named Muhammad ibn Ishaq. It survives in a couple of versions. We don't have his original. We do have a couple of versions. He dies in 767. And we have another one by his contemporary, which is only partially extant. And it's been recently refound, at least the part about Medina, not the entire thing, by a guy named Musa ibn Uqba. He's also a Medinan. I translated a text ostensibly compiled by a guy named Ma'mar al-Rashid. And Ma'mar's text is mostly, for the most part, taken from a teacher that Ma'mar ibn Ishaq and this guy Musa ibn Uqba had in common. His name is Az-Zuhri. He dies in 742. So that's when it's really starting to get written, when it starts to take shape. Probably definitely we have it taking shape in before 750, so before the Abbasids replaced the Umayyads, before the second Caliphal dynasty come along, if you don't know the dynasties. And in large part, you can tell that they have significant differences between them in details, but in large part, in terms of macro structure, the broader structure, they more or less agree, right? So they more or less agree on the most important events. They agree that Muhammad, for example, is born and from Mecca. They agree that he faced persecution. They agree that eventually that persecution led him to seek refuge with two tribes, the Aus and Khazraj to the north in a city called Yathrib, which was later renamed Medina. And they agree on the basic outline of most of the most important battles, like Badr, Uhud, Khandaq, the conquest of Mecca, the siege of Taif, and so on and so forth. Those general details are kind of historiographically in place, definitely by the first half of the 8th century.
So how did we get the Muhammad that is known today? How did we get him? That version of him.
Yeah. I guess it depends on whose Muhammad you're talking about. I guess probably in the English-speaking world, the most famous Muhammad, the one that is probably the version of him that you would encounter in most encyclopedias, textbooks, and things like that. Goes back to two books that are shortened by a Scottish Orientalist by the name of William Montgomery Watt. He wrote two books. One's called Muhammad in Mecca, Muhammad in Medina, and then they get smushed together in a nice little short book. You probably can still buy it today, called Muhammad, Prophet and Statesman. And he represents, I think, a school of Orientalism when they wrote. He kind of says it very explicitly in his preface. Unfortunately, I can't remember it word for word off the top of my head, but he says something like this. He says, "I hope to write an account that more or less faithfully reproduces what the Arabic sources say that are respected and revered by the Prophet Muhammad, and not by the Prophet Muhammad, by the Muslims themselves, but that applies sort of a non-religious, mundane historical lens to the events, but in a way that doesn't offend kind of Muslim sensibilities, right? So when they say, oh, this is kind of recognizable, but it kind of maybe doesn't lay on the piety too thick. I think that's probably the most influential reigning kind of received narrative that most people have or encounter. Probably another very common one in the English-speaking world would probably be Martin Ling's book, where he kind of compiles and puts into rather readable narrative most of the major sources about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, more from a faith-based perspective. The thing is, like the literature about Muhammad and who he is so vast and so large. I think it's very rare to find a person that encounters it in either in one fell swoop or as in like a coherent narrative whole, right? Most people, I think this probably even applies to the pious, mostly encounter him through a series of piecemeal anecdotes that aren't really stitched together in a necessarily totally coherent way. And the anecdotes about him are vast and very difficult to number. And so I would say, just in the brief version of the answer to that question, our image of the Prophet Muhammad mostly comes from modern historians that are from the first half of the last century, trying to put in modern vernacular the stories that you find in the Islamic tradition and Arabic that are regarded as prestigious within the tradition itself.
Can you tell us about the different depictions of Muhammad? Like sometimes he's understood to be a merchant, other times a shepherd.
Yeah. One of the most common ways of depicting Muhammad, I think, in modern literature, I think that has become somewhat lazy, is this idea that Muhammad was a merchant, and that's become a part of, I think, the received wisdom that's stated by our earliest authors that write about Muhammad from the outside. It's never explicitly stated in the Quran, and it's not really explicitly stated in the Muslim sources either, even though there are two kind of trade journeys that he undertakes in his life. One is a very young man who's kind of just tagging along with his uncle into Syria, and one is often narrated also when he's doing so on behalf of his, someone who will eventually become his wife, kind of a wealthy widow named Khadija, become his first wife. And so one of the things I discussed in the book is like, well, how did this idea of him being a merchant become so widely spread in secondary literature? And does it really have much of a basis in the early Arabic source material? And what I found is not really so much. It seems more to be an artifact of the Western reception of Muhammad and his life and stories about him. One of the sources that mentions him being a merchant that's extremely influential, especially in the Latin West, is a early Greek account that's redacted by a Byzantine historian by the name of Theophanes the Confessor. He probably finishes writing in the early 9th century, at least that account. And that's translated into Latin. It has a long reception history. And one of the nice things about stories about him being a merchant has a way of explaining how he came to be interested in Christianity, Judaism, all these stories about prophets and stuff that we find in the Quran. And Theophanes uses this as a kind of an explanation for, like, well, how did this guy that lived out in the middle of the Arabian desert, how do you come to have an interest in stories about Jews and Christians and things like that? Well, the answer was, well, he was a trader, and then he was going about Palestine, Syria, and going to Egypt and things like this. And he encountered all these stories. He visited churches or God knows what. And then he picked this stuff up. And that's what you have in the Quran. You have a hodgepodge of what a trader picked up while he was kind of going on. Maybe a particularly intrepid and curious trader, but, a trader all the same. And that aspect of Muhammad's life, like I said, some parts of it do appear in the Arabic sources, but it's not a major emphasis. It's not like a central thing. Oh, we know Prophet, he's a trader. The largest emphasis that you get on who the Prophet Muhammad was in terms of making a living and stuff, it's the focus goes on him being a shepherd. And this plays into a lot of key features of how leadership is imagined as being ideal. Pastoral power is considered to be very important for rulers in the ancient world. The idea that you are a shepherd of your people rather than a tyrant that rules over them and lords over them for his own interests and exploits them, but rather you're kind of benevolent shepherd is very important. And so you have a focus on him, one being a kind of a humble shepherd, and when he was young, and this following the model of Moses, of course, he was a shepherd, David, who of course was a shepherd, and so on and so forth. So he follows an archetype. It's considered a prophetic archetype.
Is there anything from the Hadith that you would consider reliable data about Muhammad, or not really?
It's interesting. Yeah, there was stuff that I would consider to be reliable. Yeah, I would say there's large amounts of material that I would consider to be reliable even. But it's not, I'll say this. How can I explain it simply? So Muslims have their own methods when it comes to, are you there still?
Yes, I am.
Okay, cool. Muslims have their own methods when it comes to kind of dealing with this very large, sometimes unwieldy corpus, right? It's tens of thousands of hadith, sayings, stories, whatever. And they have their own sort of critical methodology for working through it. And it has certain goals, and the rules that they follow in order to kind of whittle that material down serves their goals. And that goal, so simply stated, is how to be a good Muslim. Right? Historians have different goals, and we also have different rules for how we kind of attain those goals. And I would say that for the most part, the rules that historians use to attain their goals of, well, I think this is historical, this is plausible, this meets certain criteria, do not often overlap with the rules that Muslims have developed, but sometimes they do. And sometimes they converge. So two documents that I think are very likely historical that go back to the Prophet Muhammad that are preserved for us in the Hadith. They're very boring, but they are two documents that deal with, for example, what is the rate of taxation on livestock? All right, it's called sadaqah. And so if you own like X number of camels in your herds, what is the taxation rate that you have to pay? I think that very likely goes back to the Prophet Muhammad. And if not the Prophet Muhammad, then definitely one of the early caliphs, and then what's really the difference from a historian's perspective. There are other places where historians will typically affirm the historicity of something that Muslim methods don't really put a lot of stock into. So the most famous example of this is a treaty that's signed between the Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca and the Medinans that welcomed him and some of the other people that lived there, such as the Jewish tribes there. It's called the Constitution of Medina, or the Ummah document. Not an important document so much as I would say, an integral whole. It doesn't have a lot of the chains of transmission are not very good and things like that. There are some sentences and some rulings from it that do attain the status of highly regarded hadith or legally binding hadith, but as a whole, it does not kind of survive like that. Whereas kind of Muslim scholarship hasn't really put that much emphasis on it, at least traditionally. It's regarded as absolutely essential and foundational in most Western scholarship, right or wrong. I'm not. I think the jury's kind of out on it myself, but different judgments. But there are definitely things in there that, I would say, this is largely historical.
So when you try to go back and peel back the layers of mythologization, if that's the way to put it, how do we get back to the historical Muhammad? How do we get back to him?
Yeah, like to me, what the historical Muhammad is to me is kind of the image or the most plausible image of Muhammad that comes into view using historical methods, right? Not like the real Muhammad or like what Muhammad would be like if we met him or like seeing into his soul or something like this. And so ostensibly, how we go about that depends upon what method you feel works the best. So when it comes to working with Muhammad, I kind of try to think through kind of three main sources, right? First off, like for me, the primeval text of Muslim religiosity and the earliest text that we have is the Quran. And so you have all the things that get entailed, like how do you interpret the Quran, how do you deal with this transmission and things like that. So we have the Quranic corpus itself. What can we learn about Muhammad from that? I think we learned a great deal about Muhammad, by the way, surprisingly, a lot. Then after that, we start the process of, well, I guess the typical hermeneutical circle, right? So the hermeneutical circle way that works is you can have one word. A word only has meaning within the context of a sentence. A sentence really only has meaning in the context of a paragraph. A paragraph only has meaning in the context of a larger literary unit. And then that literary unit only has context in a larger work in which it appears. But also it goes back and forth. So the way that you understand the work as a whole changes based upon your understanding of a sentence. And the way that you understand the work as a whole shapes how you understand a sentence. So once we get to the Quran as that part of our circle, then we got to draw one more circle. Right? So what is that one more circle that we draw? Well, historians like to say historical context, right? But the historical context is not there. It's not a box that we can just put it in. We have to somehow reconstruct that. So how do we reconstruct that? For me as a historian, the next thing I try to draw from is what is the material evidence? What is the evidence of contemporaries? So we're talking about archaeology, epigraphy, things that are left behind written on rocks and stuff like this. Things that are written in Greek, Syriac, Armenian, from neighboring peoples and so on and so forth. And then when I have that circle drawn, I could even decide to draw a bit larger. And I can even start including the Arabic sources when we get to the 8th century. And whenever you're dealing with any source, especially the Arabic sources, you have to ask the question of, does this source material date to the exact time that it survives from, or does it contain early materials? So sometimes you can do earlier materials like that. That process is very different from what I would say the Muhammad of faith. What the Muhammad of faith does is, if you're looking for the Muhammad of faith, what you usually do is you do that same process that I talked about. You looked at the word, the sentence, the unit, and you basically get to the Quran, right? Then when you go to draw the circle for what is the context of the Quran, what's the box you put the Quran in to understand it, that's the tradition. That's the Hadith corpus. Archaeology, who cares? Epigraphy, who cares? What Sabios and Armenia said, who cares? All that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is the tradition, and that tradition becomes the context through which you understand the Quran. And I think that process, you end up with very different results.
What kind of person, the historical person, do you think Muhammad was when you try to picture him, reconstruct him?
be honest, I try to avoid that as much as possible, thinking about like in terms of personality and things like this. I'll give you some reasons why. And one of them is because as a historian, I try to do my best. I want to see what the sources themselves say, kind of denuded from as much bias as possible and as much anachronism as possible. But also just as personal taste, I kind of don't like. Some historians like to do. Well, I consider them kind of parlor tricks. So you could take, for example, a description of how the Prophet Muhammad supposedly died, or you can take a description of what it was like when Muhammad received revelation, according to the description in like the Hadith literature or something like that. And you could say, "Oh, this looks like epilepsy," or "Oh, this looks like he died of like a heart attack," or whatever. You don't know.
Uh, Hey, Sean, I lost your sound completely. I don't know what happened. No, I don't. I don't hear you at all. Nothing. Maybe you can try leaving and rejoining. Use the same link. Okay, let's wait everybody from the comeback. Sometimes this happens.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Way better. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I missed like 20. Let 20 seconds of what you said there. So just
Okay.
start from there.
Okay. So I guess when it comes to doing like I'm not into doing like moral judgments either so much because I'm more interested in reconstructing what his world was and how he interacted with it. Very willing to say like, well, this is how he viewed the world, or this is what the nature of his message was, or. But obviously, I'm not a Muslim myself, and so I had made that personal decision that like, yeah, no thanks. But that's I think that's to me the least boring, the most boring part of my work. But also I'm not when it comes to historical figures, I'm not into putting them in sort of like a moral drama, serving as like a judge in history. We all have moral luck. I consider all these people, the prophet, his companions, his enemies, they had to live through situations, face circumstances, live in an environment that is scarcely within like my imagining. And sort of my moral luck to be born at my time and place, relatively have a life of ease and plenty. I can't imagine what it was like to truly be in their shoes, and that's one of the reasons why I study the history to sort of extend my own kind of moral imagination like that.
So how do we? Let me rephrase. When do we start getting the Muhammad of Islam, the Muhammad of the faith?
Mm-hmm. But I think that when you're reading the Quran and you're kind of seeing his interactions with first and foremost those people that don't believe in his message, and you're seeing what he's preaching. I think that's generally him. I think that if you're reading, I don't know, like sort of Tahrim, which more or less is about him arguing with his wives, that's really him. When you read, you know, when you read, for example, sort of the Anfal, this is the book on the chapter on the spoils. Like, I think you're really reading him on the ground, trying to figure out justification for war, understanding the war in the terms that are meaningful to him, and trying to think about how you do things like how you divide booty correctly and justly, and appease different parties. I think that's really him, and that's you really can perceive things about him within that text. And there could be instances as well where we have specific events that are narrated from the perspective of multiple people, and we can reasonably reconstruct them. Um, where we might get something approaching someone's memory of him as well. I'm pretty skeptical of that because it gets filtered through so much kind of literary topoi and things like that. But where I'm most credulous with the later sources is where I would say where they make sense of the material realities of life in Arabia of the early 7th century. It just seemed to make sense.
What do you think caused or started the process of Muhammad's character being revised and changed so much?
Yeah. I think there's a number of things that happens. One, you see this especially by the time you get to Ibn Ishaq's Maghazi, where he becomes not just and he was always important, but he becomes more than that. He becomes not just a person that people remembered, but he becomes sort of the fulcrum of history itself. And so how do you see that in Ibn Ishaq's work? So if the original descriptions of it are correct, this is true about historical thinking in general, it's a work that begins with creation itself. It has 3 divisions. It begins with the Genesis, so it begins with creation and Adam, and it goes through human history, pretty much at a clip pace. And then the middle section is the life of Muhammad, and then the third section is the caliphs. And so the way that kind of conceives of history is that Muhammad is at its center, and his life is its central drama. And the central drama of Muhammad's life is bequeathed to and passed on to his people, his ummah, and they become the centerpiece of history. Like God has chosen them to more or less to be instruments of what he has planned for human history. History in these books is not really, human beings are not really the agents, or they're more instruments. The real main character of history in a lot of these works is God himself. So history is not like one goddamn thing happening one after another. It's providence, right? It's God's guiding hand. It has a story, it has a moral arc. The American phrase, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Like says who, right? You have to have some sort of divine providential understanding of history, and they definitely have that, and that's something that they inherited from Christians and Jews, no doubt.
What about the numismatic evidence, the coins?
Yeah.
What did they tell? What kind of story did they tell?
Yeah, the coins are very interesting. So the coins, oftentimes, this is the thing about coins. Coins are made in extremely large quantities. They're very valuable, much sought after, especially the coins that are minted by the Muslims early on, because they tend to mint them at a pretty high quality, both for the gold and the silver. Silver in the east, gold in the west. Mostly local circulation is almost always in copper. In any case, the coins are very durable. So we have a high number, high durability, and high quality, so they're often sought after, and not a lot of banks, so people tend to bury them. You get hordes of these things, and a building collapses, someone's house, God forbid, falls down or something like that, then you can have large quantities of these things. For the most part, what we learned from the coinage is that the first conquerors had a pretty pragmatic attitude towards the coinage. They weren't very quick to change it. Usually they would just counter stamp it, but like in the name of God or something like that, to make it get a little bit of a Muslim seal of approval. But there is a civil war that begins and runs its course throughout most of the 680s and ends by the early 690s. And during that civil war, we see a change happening in the coinage for the first time. It first happens in silver mintage. One of the rival caliphs starts to put the name Muhammad, and his title, Messenger of God, along the margins. And the other guy, his name's Abd al-Malik, based in Damascus, that's kind of fighting for control of the caliphate from him. He's like, good idea. And he starts to mint his own coinage. And a lot of these coins, interestingly enough, have, for the first time, I think things that we could say are first examples of imperial iconography that is distinctively Arab and also distinctively Islamic. So the famous example of this is what's usually referred to as the standing caliph coins. And he's, if you ever seen him, he's standing in the middle, right? He's on that's the kind of major design of them. And he is dressed in Arab dress. He doesn't dress like a Persian monarch or a Roman, East Roman monarch. And he has attached to his belt a sword in a sheath. And he also has hanging from his belt a scourge. And around kind of the edge of the coin, you oftentimes have a confession of faith, or earliest example of the confession of faith. So it's usually La ilaha illallah wahda, so there's no God but God alone. And then the second part, Muhammad Rasulullah, Muhammad is the messenger of God. And it's one of the things that some historians have speculated is, well, maybe this was a picture of Muhammad, right? Especially a lot of the bronze versions of these coins have that same figure, slightly differently drawn, and it just has the name Muhammad on one side and messenger of God on the other. That's one interpretation. It's one that I'm not so convinced by. We have other examples of the coins that are higher, more prestigious denomination that have rather two titles on both sides of that figure. One of the titles is the earliest title of rulers after the Arab conquest that we have attested. In Arabic, Amir al-Mu'mineen, or commander of the faithful. Amir is commander, and Mu'mineen is faithful, or believers. And on the other side, we have our first attestation to the title Caliph, the first official attestation. So it has Khalifatullah on the other side. So we have two titles of the rulers. So the other thing that leads me to interpret that standing figure as a caliph is we have these descriptions of Abd al-Malik, the first person to mint those coins, actually, where he's said to have a sword to kind of punish those who defy him, and a whip to punish those who disobey him. And so it seems to be associated directly with the iconography of a caliph and his authority. Yeah, there
Are
it
these
is.
one of the coins we're talking about?
Yes, it is. Yeah, yes, it is. You can see the thing that's hanging down from his right-hand side is the scourge. And then the what looks like a whooping paddle is actually his sword in its sheath. Yeah. And he's in Arab dress.
So who do you think this is a depiction of actually?
Of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, I think. The Caliph Abd al-Malik. Yeah, that's who I would say. Yeah.
What makes some even think that this is Muhammad in the first place? Why do they think that?
One, you have Muhammad named on the coin right there. But also you have a Byzantine coin. So this is the obverse of the coin. If you look at the reverse of the coin, it has a staircase and it has a pillar on the top of it. We're not really sure what that represents. I think the best explanation is actually supposed to be a representation of Jerusalem. Yeah, there you go. And if you look at the Byzantine coinage that's minted more or less contemporaneously with it, on the obverse of that, you have a picture of Jesus. So you have Christ on that coin. That's also a gold coin. And on the flip side, the reverse sign, you have a same thing with the stairs, but then on top of that stairs, you have a cross. And then you have a picture of the emperor next to the cross. So the idea would be, the parallel would be, the emperor is on the reverse, but like your icon, your founder, sort of like your George Washington in essence, is on the obverse side of the coin.
When did these coins date?
These coins date usually to like early 690s. They're very quickly replaced by the new reform coinage. So there's a series of coinage reforms. I can't remember when exactly this one was done. Usually, this picture is one from the year 77, and I can't convert it off the top of my head. I think that's early 690s. I hope that's right. But very quickly, it's replaced by what we call the aniconic coinage. So coinage without any iconography whatsoever. And instead of having coinage with pictures of people or things like that, they're just coinage with Quranic verses on them, and that becomes the standard for quite some time until the Abbasid period. Eventually, it changes.
So to come back to reconstructing the historical Muhammad, are we also able to get a pretty good idea of chronology, like when this or when that happened in his life from the
Mhm.
earliest reliable data?
Yeah, I think that there are some dates, of course, that are much more certain than others. What are some of the most difficult dates to kind of get are kind of to get established and to know well? Or, for example, when did the first incursions of armies out of Arabia into kind of Roman territory really begin? But we have a really good sense of, for example, when Muhammad's hijrah was. So when did he go from Mecca to Medina? And why do we have a really good sense of that? One, the hijrah is very explicitly kind of narrated in the Quran itself. So we know it's a real event. But the real kind of thing that makes it possible is it starts to be used at an extremely early date. And so we have a series of documents and also inscriptions and dedications to buildings and so on and so forth that use this date, this Hijri date, this date counting from Hijrah. And one of the reasons why we know the date is correct is because in a lot of those early documents, they use multiple dating. So they'll use more than one calendar. So they'll use sort of the Egyptian calendar, or they'll use the Seleucid calendar, or they'll use like an addiction, or they'll use a provincial calendar. And you can more or less cross-check the dating to know that you're getting the count right, right? And when you count backwards, it always lands at 622. Um, Also helpful to this is one of the earliest words for Muslims that are used in non-Muslim sources. This is attested in Greek at a very early date, in a Greek papyrus and multiple Greek papyri actually. It's also attested in Syriac. The Arabic word is al-Muhajirun. And these are the people that, Muhajirun literally means people that do the hijrah. And so you have different types of these Muhajirun. You'll have the so-called al-Muhajirun al-Awwalun, the first people that did hijrah, the first hijrah people. These are mentioned in the Quran directly. These are the people that undertake that journey, ostensibly from Mecca to Medina, but also the people that leave the Arabian Peninsula and they settle in the garrison cities founded by the Arab conquerors and also in some of the other cities that they occupied, like Damascus and so on, are also called Muhajirun. And the people that lived in these provinces picked this up pretty early. Some of our earliest documents to mention the Arabs in general, they know them by this name. In Syriac, it's Mahagoye. It's in Greek, it's Magaritai. And these words are, prior to the Arab conquest, unattested. So they don't appear in Greek prior to the Arab conquest. They don't appear in Syriac prior to the Arab conquest. So it's pretty clear that it's a borrowing from Arabic. And so this gives us an image of the Hijra as not a one-time event, but as a kind of archetypal event that's kind of recapitulated and becomes a part of the conquest. And the fact that they begin using this calendar at an extremely early date lets us know that something really significant happened. So there's just a lot of, I think, overlapping and converging evidence that points to that.
How many battles from what these texts say did Muhammad participate in, and is there any like historical issues of anything that he was said to be a part of? stuff like that.
Quite a large number. Actually, I don't remember them. I don't remember the number of battles off the top of my head. This is a very common feature of the literature. I know I've written it, what it is, what the exact number is. But the most important ones that are associated with him directly, let me go through them in order, hopefully I don't mess them up, is the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, the Battle of Khandaq, the conquest of Mecca, the Battle of Hunain, and then the Battle of Tabuk. I'm probably leaving one out. Khaybar, I forgot about Khaybar. Also, some things that are considered to be expeditions are listed in this that really aren't expeditions or counted. The most famous of these is probably Hudaybiyah, and this happens before the conquest of Mecca, before the conquest of Khaybar, where he essentially travels as a pilgrim to Mecca, and then he's stopped by the Meccan disbelievers outside, and they have a negotiation where they agree to like a sort of a ceasefire for a while. And it's when that ceasefire is broken under dubious circumstances that we have the conquest of Mecca that occurs. But yeah, he's pretty active in warfare. And Tabuk is the going to the north. The Tabuk was considered to be the border between Arabia proper and the beginning of the Levant. At least that's what a lot of the early sources call it. That's probably the farthest north that he went, according to early Muslim sources. Yeah, he was a major part of his life and a major part of his campaigning. But there's also a large number of campaigns that he commanded other people to go out on his behalf. Probably the one that went farthest north was the battle called Mu'tah. Yeah, they did. There's lots of battling. He was a conqueror. He was a state builder. He was the one that more or less created a polity that united the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula for the first time. He did that mainly through conquest. But he also did so through diplomacy as well, but mainly through conquest. And there were previous attempts to do it, but he's the one that did it in a way that was successful in the long term for the first time and really for the only time. I guess one thing to say about that, it might be interesting, is, we have many examples of the horse nomads of the steppe, whether they be the Huns, whether it be the Oghuz Turks, or whether it be the Avars or in the Mongols. We go on down the line. We have a lot of instances where we have these steppe empires that arise and come into being, but really only have one instance. We have an empire emerging from Arabia.
What do you make of the stories about Muhammad and the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius? Excuse me. Is there any real history behind that?
I don't think there's any real history whatsoever. I think they're fun stories, but I don't think they're history. What's fascinating, at least what I tried to point out, is that the basis, or the story making, the basis, or the weaving of that story does have surprisingly old roots. Like the story of Heraclius having this vision of a circumcised people taking him over and things like that is very old, and it's shared between both Muslim sources and non-Muslim sources. And maybe the different versions that we have might be an example of, or the byproduct of their interaction with one another, which that story, I think, reveals that it happened to a surprising degree, right? So I would say, just as a general rule, one of the things that marks out and distinguishes sort of history as done by folks like me and the more traditional methods is most traditional scholars from within the Muslim tradition, tend to view these sources within kind of the silo of Arabic source material itself. There's not really a lot of comparative method, and it doesn't really any comparative method doesn't really serve the goals so much of what the tradition wants to accomplish. Like I said, to become a good Muslim. But our methods, we are much more keen to say, well, what happens when we read these two stories alongside one another? What do we learn? And to me at least, is languages, traditions, they're not impermeable boundaries. They're actually really quite permeable. And they jump across linguistic traditions and historiographical traditions quite a bit.
How did we get that story of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius in the first place?
Um, so it depends on which version we're talking about. But the Muslim version, I suggest, might have originally relied upon a Christian story that probably originated in Palestine. And it has an afterlife that we can follow in the Arabic tradition. And it has an afterlife that we can follow, surprisingly enough, in like early Latin medieval texts like Pseudo Fredegar. So I try to trace it to its ultimate origins are more or less obscure and unknown in terms of the actual figure. But the main person that's responsible for the wording of the story in the Islamic tradition cites very explicitly that he kind of got the story from a Christian guy. We don't know if he got the name right or whatever. He calls him Ibn Natura. And I speculate that he could have been a scribe. He could have been a member of the ecclesiastical order. He could have been someone that was actually not the Patriarch of Jerusalem, but the person that was holding the office of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem until a new patriarch could be elected and things like that. We don't really know, but I think in terms of the who exactly and the identity, but what I try to argue is that the evidence that there is a common source for all these stories and that it's very old is nonetheless really solid.
So back to the mythologization process. In which time period would you say that the process started, where Muhammad's character starts to experience major changes? Under which government? Who was doing this and why? When?
I think it happens very early, and it's hard to say who's doing it. So, one of the typical stories that we get is that most of the stories that are told about the life of the Prophet Muhammad in a systematic way are supposed to be kind of confined to a specialist cadre of teacher and pupil. And it's not necessarily either encouraged by the state or widely embraced by the state. And then you have a different sort of group of people that are more or less preachers in mosques that are in the employ of local governors, caliphs, rival caliphs, and things like that. And they have their own versions of the story and things like this. And sometimes we see there's two different groups, right? People that are on official employ by caliphs, governors, and other officials to give sermons and pious stories and things like that. And then serious scholars that have their pupils and their sessions and stuff that they teach. But it really seems that they more interact and they overlap really quite a bit. And the most important things that happens for us, at least how we encounter these stories, is there are probably many stories, many ways to tell the life of the Prophet Muhammad that don't survive. And they just don't reach us. But every time at a key moment in history, usually some rich, wealthy patron will intervene and say, write all this down, record all this, or put this all in a book. And these create kind of a series of bottlenecks. So our earliest example of this is probably when the Umayyad caliphs have this scholar who's very close to them named Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri. He's originally from Medina, but he's very close to the Umayyad court as well. He's the guy that dies in 742. They say all this oral tradition, all of these stories, we're going to have some scribes, we're going to sit them down, and you're just going to tell everything you know. And we're going to have this systematic record of all this material. And we have, some examples of that material, we think. One of them, we have a papyrus that's supposedly dictated by, or at least related on the authority of one of the scribes that sat at those sessions of Zuhri. And that was a key moment. Zuhri is a very important figure. None of the really original material survived, but his fingerprint on the entire tradition can be seen kind of very broadly. And the other main figure for this is Muhammad bin Ishaq, who is more or less encouraged by the Abbasid court right after the Abbasid Revolution, which is successful in 750. And one of the early Abbasid caliphs, the guy that founded Baghdad, his name's Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, just al-Mansur for short, brings Ibn Ishaq to, we don't know if he brought him, but he takes Ibn Ishaq under his patronage, and he begins teaching his materials, even though Ibn Ishaq was originally from Medina. And those materials are, again, very famous. There's another guy after him, too, named al-Waqidi. He's also a Medina historian. His writings are also very famous. But you'll have these interventions. But all this raises a question, too. Were the caliphs creating a tradition, or were they harnessing something that was already there, and maybe in a much more protean form or not a systematic form, and giving the resources and the opportunity to kind of coalesce it in a systematic kind of written collection? And this kind of, I lean towards that second option. And one of the reasons why I do is that not all of the works that were compiled or written down and things like that were done so at the behest of the caliph. Many of them seem to be done at the behest of basically middle-class urbanites that are, I would call them hobbyists, but they are so obsessed that they're more like these guys that somehow managed to, like, I like G.I. Joes growing up, like, that managed to collect every single version of, a G.I. Joe action figure, and every single, like, as an adult. They're collectors, and they're very passionate collectors, and their collections are very large, very extensive, and very closely curated. And they do so on their own initiative, oftentimes with their own money or with the money of a wealthier friend who is not oftentimes involved in the government. And so I don't think all of these texts are the result of the intervention of government authorities.
And would you say that the Muhammad that most people imagine today, they're relying on the Muhammad that they are told about from later texts and not more earlier and reliable and more trustworthy sources? They're going by much later revisionist text.
Yeah. I would say so. I guess that's true. It's a question of like, what did people know about Muhammad in the first place? Even pious. I mean, most people don't really bother to make a systematic auditing of their knowledge and things like that. I think the joke is always made that most Americans know their biblical history from Hollywood and not really from the Bible. I do have like a broad idea, like, oh yeah, I know the Moses story. I saw the cartoon, but they never read Exodus, right? I think that for most people's impression of Muhammad as like a devotional figure, is like, yeah, he's like the best guy ever, and the guy that I've heard a bunch of preaching stories about and things like that. And I think when people systematically begin reading their sources, whether you're talking about a critical history written by a modern historian, or whether or not you're talking about, say, Ibn Ishaq, or even reading through Bukhari's text, are often really shocked and really surprised with the type of material that they find there, sometimes unsettled, sometimes pleasantly surprised.
What do you think made the historical Muhammad the famous man that he became later?
Yeah. I mean, he created an entire civilization. I mean, it's hard to understate it. So I would say, to give a parallel, to me, the most powerful force of the ancient world was Hellenism. And Christianity was a very powerful force too, but Hellenism kind of shaped what cities looked like, and shaped what like education looked like. Hellenism is why the New Testament is written in Greek and so on and so forth. Um, I'm reluctant to say that Hellenism was more powerful than Christianity because Christianity was a very powerful force. Um, but when I think about the force that was powerful enough to kind of fully supplant Hellenism, it would be Islam. Islam was that force. It changed what cities look like. I mean, once you kind of unite the Eurasian axis, that is now today we usually call it the Middle East, but it is the supreme civilization of the old world. No offense to China, but they're too far to the east. I mean, they're the crossroads of the ancient world, and that really begins with these conquests that emerge out of Arabia. Arabia itself is very large, the size of India. So uniting that is not some small feat, but kind of mobilizing the resources of Arabia in terms of manpower and culture, and spreading its language and this new religion, all the way from the Pyrenees to the Transoxus. I think it kind of created the medieval world eventually, and it's only when that kind of middle civilization that sits upon, I said, the Eurasian axis was circumvented by the Portuguese and then the quote-unquote discovery of the New World, that balance begins to change. I think he's the starting point, right? That's where it begins. Very interesting legacy, right? I do consider him more like a figure like a Columbus or something like that. Starting a new kind of era in history.
What is your take on? Because there are some people out there that believe this. I'm sure you've heard of them. Muhammad mythicists.
Yeah.
What do you think of? What do you think of that?
Mostly think it's boring, but also my question is, this is, to me the evidence is very solid and very straightforward, and it's okay if you want to say that it's not good enough for you. That's fine. But if you're going to consistently apply that method, then vast swaths of history are effectively unknowable. And maybe that's true. I mean, if we want to get really philosophical about like history and what's knowable and things like that, sure, maybe it's true. Maybe the universe was created 5 seconds ago with all our memories intact too. Like maybe, we can get philosophical about it. But in general, I just don't find that they argue with the evidence, and I find they usually argue against the evidence. And I think when you're doing history, when you find yourself arguing against evidence rather than arguing with evidence, then you're not in the ideal position.
Earlier, I got a question from a member of the audience, Venus Craig. How do we get to the Aramaic Syrian monk to Arabic Quran as a historical?
Okay. So there is a story that becomes very popular in, probably at least by the early 9th century, maybe it's a little bit earlier. It's definitely attested in some version earlier than that, especially in the writings of John of Damascus, where people try to explain, well, where does Muhammad get this knowledge from? How does he know about the Bible? How does he know about prophets? How does he know about David, Moses, etc.? And the explanation they have is, he was taught by a monk. Usually they say he was an Arian monk. And the monk's name is Sergius. Sometimes he's called Sergius Bahira to make him connected to another figure in the Arabic tradition. That doesn't seem to be historical in any way. I mean, it's possible. It's out there as a kind of broad cosmic possibility that Muhammad had a teacher that was a monk, or he was in contact with the monastics. But we just don't have any hard evidence for that. But we do have that just so story that's written by Christians. I kind of see that literature very much in the same vein as I see kind of the polemical Jewish literature against Jesus of Nazareth. that we find attested, for example, in the Talmud, right, where Jesus was born of he was born a bastard from Ben Pandera, this kind of Roman soldier, or instead of a miracle worker, he was actually a magician or something like this. Those stories are very much along those lines, and I don't put a lot of credit to them in terms of their historicity. But I mean, the Syria literature also does mention Muhammad's early interactions with monks and people that knew the Bible. Probably the most famous example is his fellow clansman of Quraysh, Warqa ibn Nawfal, which is also a relative of his wife, Khadija, supposedly knew the Bible. And he plays this role. He passes away early in Muhammad's career. He plays this role as kind of a confirmatory person, a person that like hears the Quran and is like, oh yeah, this is definitely legit. It's a very common literary trope. He's a little bit like a John the Baptist to Muhammad.
What do you think? What do you make of this of Cadmon and Muhammad?
The Kedmon story, yeah. So the Kedmon story is very interesting. So So there's two things. So if you read the earliest accounts of Muhammad's revelation and you read the story of Kedmon, this early Anglo-Saxon poet, they're almost exactly identical. And so the question is, how do you explain them? The Kedmon story, we have our earliest version that's extant, is in the Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History. And the earliest extent of Muhammad is Ibn Ishaq or maybe Zuhri. So what do you do with that? How to explain it? So one of the things you could say is like, well, this is actually a very early Arabic story. Somehow it made it up to Bede. It reached the British Isles somehow, right? And I talk about that. I explore that possibility. That possibility is I think, favored maybe still by Gregor Scheuler, a very prominent scholar whose work I relied quite a bit. And another explanation is they're not related at all. I don't find that convincing. And then the third, or the one that I kind of prefer, was that Bede is relying upon a earlier hagiographical story, and Ibn Ishaq, Zuhri, the whole kind of tradition about Muhammad is relying upon that same earlier story, but that story is lost to us. We don't know what that story is. In the book, I mentioned some possible examples. The possible example that I'm most inclined to is that of a guy by the name of Romanos, the melodist. He's attributed to him as this type of hymn in Greek called the Kontakion. But we don't have the oldest version of the story of his life. We only have a abbreviated version. And it seems to me very possible, he was from Syria and things like that, that the story of his life might have influenced that of Muhammad and that of Kedmon, because he's like a great hymnographer. He writes hymns and things like that. But that's just speculation on my part.
So do you think that the story is pretty much mythical? Or is it history?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's mythical. I mean, it has aspects that are true, right? It happened in Mecca. Khadija was his wife and things like that. But I think mostly that sort of stuff is sort of lost. That's lost to the fog of time. A real curious aspect of, say, if we compare the Quran to the Sirah, most of the chapters of the Quran as we have it now are dated by the tradition, but also by modern scholars by different criteria, to the so-called Meccan period, the vast majority of the Quranic text. The lesser part of the Quranic text is that last 10 years in which Muhammad was in Medina. Flip that, and you get a picture of the Sirah material. Very little is known about the Meccan period. Very large amount is known about the Medinan period. And this is natural, right? Once you get kind of deeper into the well of memory, things become foggier. Things become more difficult to kind of discern. in terms of like how old Muhammad was when he received revelation, how old he was when he died, what his birth date was, and what events it corresponded with. This is all probably entirely lost, and most of its reconstruction is based upon a mixture of storytelling, numerology, and astrology.
What do you make of the various stories about Muhammad's wife? Some critics of Muhammad will say, "Oh, he married a child and all that other
Yeah,
stuff." They're
yeah.
relying on the Hadith or some other text for that
Mhm.
information. What
Yeah.
do you make?
I think it's probably right. I mean, it's broadly attested in the tradition. It's at the earliest level of the tradition. It doesn't seem, most of the explanations as to why it would be made up, I don't find to be generally convincing. And it was not a society with or same race around prepubescent marriage. Yeah, I don't know, the tradition ostensibly comes from her family, and her family is a well-known scholarly family, and they mention marrying their own daughters at a very young age as well. And yeah, that's just the way it was. Um, you know, Abraham does some weird stuff too.
So, what would you say are like? Let me rephrase. What would you recommend to readers that are trying to like carefully read some of these sources? Try to that
Mhm.
ones that really want to know as
Mhm.
best they can who Muhammad really was.
Yeah. Um, well, I would say, um, I mean, it's an interesting question because you want to say like, well, it depends on what you want to know about him. Like, you want to know like what was the strategy that allowed him to unite Arabia. That's one thing. If you want to know something about his teachings, his moral teachings, his teachings about the afterlife and things like that, and just read the Quran, you get a very good idea of that. It's a pretty good register of that. If you want to get a sense of um, how Muslims remembered him in their historical memory, and which is also extremely important for how they imagine kind of the ideal moral man, then I would read a reliable seerah or just read a seerah that's influential. And there's a lot that you can choose to do that. If you like, personally, as a story, I like reading just about anything. I really like Ibn Ishaq's book, but the problem with Ibn Ishaq's book is, as it is recommended to people, it's really thick. At least in the English translation, and most people would not get through it. We do have I don't think I have it here. We do have a shorter seerah, one of the earliest ones. It's by Musa ibn Uqba. Actually, I do have a copy of it here. And this one is translated by Dara Arqam. Actually, I would buy it. I mean, it's very readable. It's short, and I mean, it's not the greatest piece of literature that you'll ever read, but you'll get a general impression of like a minimalist sense of the Sierra literature, I think. And there's another translation that's it's very nice too. I find them all to be relatively uh, readable as translations. You'll mostly be struck by just how, you know, 40% of it is a big long list of names, but you can skip over that. It's pretty easy to read. Um, and also, if you another thing I also recommend people to do is to pick up, like a chapter of Bukhari. Bukhari has a book called Kitab al-Maghazi that's inside his Sahih. That's online. Just go to sunnah.com, read through it. You get a sense of things. Um, and whenever you're interested in any sort of topic, just pick up, say, a Muslim, pick up Bukhari, look at it online, read through it. But if I think also a lot of these books can feel overwhelming if you don't have like a structure. like a general structure in terms of like, oh, this is where I'm going to put this information, this drawer and that drawer and that drawer. You get overwhelmed with the wave of Arabic names or places that you're not familiar with. I think a really excellent, very readable account of what changed from pre-Islamic and Near East to the post-Islamic Near East is the opening part of Michael Cook's new History of the Muslim World. I think it's really excellent. It's an audiobook. I would much listen to that too. That's a really good place to start.
Do we know anything reliable about how Muhammad came to believe what he believed, and his and what his parents passed down to him regarding that? Like, what did he actually think about Judaism and Christianity, and how did those religions influence the way he thinks, the way he thought?
Yeah. So his parents more or less didn't raise him, if we believe the tradition. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was really quite young. But also the tradition portrays Muhammad in a way that he's miraculously protected from the errors of the old religion, right? He never worships idols. He never, eats meat that was sacrificed to idols. He never accidentally stumbles upon a rowdy kind of raucous or debaucherous like party in town and things like this. Some stories even have literally he's turning the corner and he passes out, so he doesn't see anything bad. But if we look at the Quran and what's in the Quran, and we get a sense of his views of things, I think the Quran tells us a lot about his environment, and that is very different from what we get in the Syria literature. It doesn't describe the sort of Arabia that's rife with idols and things like that. It does describe an Arabia full of people that don't necessarily buy into Christianity or Judaism or anything like that, or believe in the afterlife. That they definitely believe in a cosmos full of they believe in a demon haunted world, that in the demons that haunt that world can do them favors, can do them both good and ill. And I think what he does is he brings a very kind of late antique Jewish Christian view to an Arabian context. And how would I say that very simply? So for him, he doesn't learn it from Christians and Jews. We can speculate about how he kind of gets his ideas. But for him, he gets it directly from God, and so from the source. But for me, what he really gets from Christians and Jews is this basic idea that God created human beings and put them in this world to test them. And he filled the world with signs and beauty and blessings and also trials that they're supposed to ponder. And it's supposed to become self-evident to them that they're created beings from this master creator God. And this will all culminate in their death and eventual resurrection, and then judgment either unto perdition and eternal hell, or judgment into felicity for the righteous and eternal delights. And he kind of, that basic scaffolding is something that you get in the Quran, and it doesn't seem to have been prevalent or widespread among his people, insofar as the people he's arguing with throughout most of the Quran seem to deny it. They deny the resurrection, for example. They deny the idea that God will punish them for practicing religion the wrong way, or for bad religion as they see it. And he's very keen to preach to them that the sanctuary nearby which they live was not just any old sanctuary of their tribe, but is of their anonymous forefathers that gave them the customs of the cult that's associated with that sanctuary, but rather that sanctuary was founded by Abraham and Ishmael, their forefathers, and it was given very specific rites and customs that they were supposed to observe in the worship of one God, and they kind of disagree about that. Eventually he wins out.
What do we know about Muhammad's death? Like, do we know how he died?
Mm-hmm. We definitely have stories about how he died. Sick for a number of days, maybe under processes of delirium. And when the most interesting thing is about his death is not necessarily how he died of his fever or whatever it was, but the sort of disarray that followed very quickly in his death. So when he does die, it definitely seems to be something that was a shock, was unexpected. And there is a big disagreement over who should lead the Medinans, basically, and the entire polity across Arabia. Some factions thought, well, he's passed on, the gig is up now, let's all go home. All the Meccans that came to live in Medina can go back to Mecca now. You'll rule your affairs, we'll rule our affairs. That wasn't the direction that things were taken in. Eventually, his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, took the leadership of the community. In the memory of some currents within Islam, it should have gone to the Prophet's family, in particular to his son-in-law, Ali. And the story about that is very interesting. I mean, when Abu Bakr's leadership was decided, they were doing the preparation for Muhammad's burial, ostensibly. There are other reactions that are recorded as well. The second guy who eventually becomes the second caliph, Omar, he supposedly denied that he died altogether. Right? Again, lots of different options, a lot of different stories that are told about this. That's really the most interesting part of his death, is that it seems to be completely unexpected, and there wasn't a lot of plans about what to do. If there were explicit plans, they definitely were not followed. You definitely have currents within Shiism that think that definitely there were plans, it's just they were disobeyed, and a huge swath of the Prophet's companions disbelieved and betrayed their faith by not following those instructions and appointing Ali to be a successor and things like that.
How did the idea that Muhammad wrote the Quran or received it, how did that come to be? When did that come to be?
So you have different views on this. I personally believe that the Quran was from the very beginning written down. It was both ritually performed and orally performed, and also had a written record. There's a number of reasons why I believe this. It's a bit more complex to get into, but to give you a couple of examples of why I think that, they mostly have to do with the references to writing and written materials in the Quran itself, the way that our earliest manuscripts look, and we have extremely early manuscripts that date to the first half of the 7th century, I believe, and also has to do with the very widespread and common mention of stories about the Quran being written down. It's probably one of the most famous examples of this. I just talked about Omar, so it's fresh in mind. In the Meccan period, one of the reasons why Omar supposedly converted is that he caught his sister with a piece of the Quran that was written down. According to some accounts, it was written on a bone, and he hit his sister over the head with that bone and cracked her head. That was before he was a good guy. Eventually, he regrets it. And so we have references to the Quran being written down quite often, and we have a large number of people that are listed as those who wrote the Quran down during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and also people that were ostensibly in his employ. And we have references throughout, so outside of the narrative material that comes later, in the Quran itself, we have references to the use of writing and recommendations of the use of writing for transactions, documents, manuscript contracts, and things like that. So I think it was a hybrid document from the very beginning, both written down and oral.
So my final question, when did the final Quran come to being? Like, when was it finished?
Yeah. So almost all of our Qurans, except for one, they descend from a singular text type. If you're familiar with New Testament studies or biblical studies and things like that, usually the New Testament will talk about either the Textus Receptus or the Byzantine text type and things like this. For the Quran, we really only have one text type that's broadly attested in our manuscripts, and we usually call that Uthmanic text type because the fourth caliph is the one who ostensibly collected that Quran as the standard Quran and then sent multiple copies thereof to kind of major cities. How many of these is disputable, but there's at least 4 or 5, with the Medinan one being like the main one. So it's Uthman did it well after Muhammad had died, but relatively soon too. So Muhammad dies in 632. The collection of the Quran was probably done by 650, and it was probably based upon earlier versions of the collected Quran. And I think we have a large amount of evidence that that did indeed happen. Not necessarily how it's exactly narrated in the earliest story, which is almost always narrated by Zuhri, this guy that died in 742, that I mentioned multiple times. But why I think that, in addition, setting aside the arguments from the narrative, we have a very large number of early manuscripts that date from within the first 200 years of the Islamic period. We have a pretty good means of understanding how the paleography, or the way that you write Arabic, changed over that time period, and good samples from kind of each layer. We have a good amount of evidence doing codicology, so comparing different copies of the Quran to see which one derives from the other. And we also have really good evidence in terms of radiocarbon dating. There's some people that, again, have tried to poo-poo some of this evidence or aspects of the evidence, but I think it's a table that has many legs. You can kick one leg out and you still have many legs holding it up. And for the most part, I think the arguments against it, or again, arguing against evidence rather than with evidence. And so I find the case for the mid-7th century codification of the Quran very strong. Sorry, my dog is being annoying.
No problem. Call John 97. Thank you for becoming a member of the channel. Appreciate it. I want to remind everybody real quick, the link to purchase Muhammad and the Empires of the Faith, the making of the Prophet of Islam, will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. That being said, Sean, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.